Deliver Me From Nowhere, The Making of Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska, Warren Zanes. Prologue, The Rhinoceros Club. We were sitting in the cramped dressing room at the back of the Rhinoceros Club in Greensboro, North Carolina, a little place on South Green Street across from the Carolina Theater. It was January 17th, 1985. Since we were due to go on stage in 10 or 15 minutes, the drinking had picked up. I was in my late teens at the time, a kid guitar player in a rock and roll band called the Del Fuegos. The club, about 100-person capacity, was probably half full. Not bad for a cold night in the Mid-South. Our itinerary would take us farther down the eastern seaboard, then west, one small rock club to the next, until winter was behind us. But the palm trees were weeks away. We were writing out a set list for the show when Nils Lofgren came in the dressing room door. Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band were on tour, taking a night off between shows in Charlotte and Greensboro. Born in the USA was on his third single of 7, the title track, Born in the USA. Calling the album a triumph had become something of a reflex among critics. Of course, if you grew up in the Northeast, most of my band had, triumph seemed like Bruce's native territory. But yes, this one was bigger. Even Bruce's body had changed, as if in response to it all. He had muscles. Excited to have Nils Lofgren there with us, we asked him to come on stage for a few songs, handed him one of our backup guitars, and suggested In the Midnight Hour in the key of E. And that's about when the door opened again, and Bruce Springsteen walked in. "I got your album," Springsteen said as he came into the room. "Backseat Nothing is my favorite song." He spoke before we could. Then we couldn't. Minutes later, Springsteen was leading us through a few sloppy rock and roll classics, Hang On Sloopy and Stand By Me. He couldn't be blamed for the sloppiness. We brought that. But he knew the place and was generous enough to go back there to meet us. He stretched the songs out, let some joy flood the room, made a few people reconsider the possibility of small-town miracles. There was only one payphone in the Rhinoceros Club, but word had got out fast. By the time Springsteen finally exited the stage and went into the night, with a little help from security, the room was probably 3 times its legal capacity. For the next 2 years, every interview we did started with the same question: what was it like to play with Bruce Springsteen? We just put out that first record of ours. We're still searching for some idea of who we were and what, if anything, we had to contribute to the great many-voiced conversation/argument of rock and roll. And one of our heroes happened to walk into the club on South Green Street where we were playing. In that moment in American life, it seemed you couldn't turn on a radio without hearing Bruce Springsteen or buy a magazine without seeing him. But that wasn't what mattered to us. Not right then. It wasn't even the earlier records like Born to Run or Darkness on the Edge of Town that were on our minds, though we knew them line for line. When our dressing room door opened and Bruce Springsteen walked in, we had one thought: that's the guy who made Nebraska. Introduction: The King of Pop and the Beer Can. A few weeks after getting on stage at Greensboro's Rhinoceros Club, Bruce Springsteen wrapped up the first leg of the Born in the USA North American tour. The final show was in Syracuse, January 27th, 1985. Some 50,000 people in attendance. Having completed more than 90 shows and needing the break, Springsteen nonetheless got on a plane the day after the show and headed for A&M Studios in Los Angeles. There he participated in the USA for Africa recording, being produced by Quincy Jones. Springsteen flew commercial, then grabbed a rental car at the airport. He wasn't an entourage kind of guy. Roseanne Cash would later describe watching Springsteen walk unnoticed through a large crowd of New York City tourists, using only a hoodie. "It's my invisibility cloak," he told her. He knew how to get around. When it came to Los Angeles, the city was a second home of sorts. LAX was a breeze. It was an easy, familiar drive from there to the A&M lot. They were valet parking cars at A&M. One of the attendants handling the operation was the top record executive, willing to do some honest work if that was his only way to be a part of the evening. Husbands and wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, and children, none were allowed into the studio where the recording would happen. Steve Perry from Journey, first to come and last to leave, had already found a spot for himself in the control room when Springsteen was still on his way from the airport. He was watching Quincy Jones record Michael Jackson's vocal part, asking no one in particular, "Am I on drugs?" Springsteen, before getting to the valet parking, found a good spot on La Brea. It was something he couldn't resist. He parked in the street and walked by foot to the studio, passing the office inside the gate that had once belonged to Charlie Chaplin. The list of artists who showed up that night was striking, still is. Willie Nelson, Diana Ross, Bob Dylan, Stevie Wonder, Dionne Warwick, Ray Charles, Tina Turner, Billy Joel, Paul Simon, Bette Midler, Kenny Rogers, Steve Perry, Cyndi Lauper, Al Jarreau. There were others. Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie wrote the song they'd be singing. Historically speaking, it was the largest gathering of star power ever to come together in a recording studio to perform what most of them believed was a terrible song. I don't think anybody liked it, Billy Joel recalled. Cyndi Lauper is reported to have described it as a Pepsi commercial. How did it all come together? As Ryan D'Agnostio would later recount in Esquire, the organizing was a matter of making a lot of calls until Bruce Springsteen agreed to participate. Bruce was in. Everybody wanted in. Michael Jackson, mostly quiet throughout his session that went all night, saw Springsteen's empty Budweiser can and asked someone to take his picture with it. When Michael Jackson is getting his photo taken with your beer can, you could say things are going well career-wise. Born in the USA was like a light shine directly in the eyes. It overwhelmed everything else. For all the glory and hard work of Springsteen's career, in 1985, there would be vast parts of the audience who didn't know the prehistory. The fabled beginnings, a record deal reportedly signed on a car hood with Columbia's legendary A&R man John Hammond, the celebrated Born to Run, a young man who was on the covers of Time and Newsweek the very same week. The new fans would find out about all that over time. But just then, they saw the guy in a video dancing with what appeared to be an underage girl, singing Dancing in the Dark. He wasn't even holding a guitar. It wasn't just Ronald Reagan who mistook Springsteen for another man, though Reagan did it most publicly when he aligned himself with Born in the USA, touting Springsteen as a man who understood Reagan's kind of American values. People were getting shit wrong. The aftermath of the Born in the USA tour, Springsteen wrote in Born to Run, was a strange time. It was the peak of something. I would never be here this high in the mainstream pop firmament again. It was the end of something. While others might bask in such a moment, Springsteen saw it all differently, as the end of something. One thing that was obscured in it all was the album that came before Born in the USA, Nebraska. Of all his albums, it was the furthest from Born in the USA. It was also the very thing that allowed Born in the USA to come into being. Nebraska had something of a time-release quality. It revealed its strange power over the years, a thing people found in their own way and on their own time. It was passed around like a rumor. Artists of different kinds would still be tapping Nebraska's meaning years after its initial release. I interviewed several musicians and songwriters for this book, some who heard Nebraska when it came out, some who would find it later. I wanted to know their Nebraskas. Patty Griffin, Steve Earle, Richard Thompson, Roseanne Cash, and others. Most of them I knew from playing shows or working on documentaries. Their thoughts would infuse my own as I searched through the layers of Nebraska. They became a part of this book. The lead singer of The National, Matt Berninger, was one of those artists. Born in the USA was my first experience, really, he told me. I think I was 13 when it came out. My sister was just starting Columbia House, the mail-order thing. 8 CDs for a penny. So she was buying tons of stuff. The Smiths, U2, Born in the USA was one of them. Berninger was no different from so many others of his generation, tuned into MTV, listening to terrestrial radio, borrowing an older sibling's music, absorbing all that he could. Springsteen, Prince, Madonna, the giants of the time, were seemingly omnipresent, blown up to an unprecedented scale through the increased visuality of popular culture. One day, though, Berninger would be on a stage with his own group, covering Mansion on the Hill from Springsteen's Nebraska album. I didn't actually hear Nebraska until a couple of years after hearing Born in the USA, he went on, maybe freshman year in college, but out of sequence. That's when I think I was like, there's more to Bruce Springsteen than this cultural giant I'm seeing. I mean, Born in the USA was this Madonna level thing. The discovery of a record like Nebraska, after the ubiquity and endless singles of Born in the USA, was particularly striking. In the process of taking in the superstars of his adolescence and then learning that some of them, like Prince, had prehistories, Berninger also learned that there was only one artist with a record like Nebraska. Nebraska wasn't some obscurity from an earlier point in the artist's career, a collection of outtakes or relics, nothing like that. It was Springsteen's sixth official release, the follow-up to his first #1 album, The River. To hear Bruce Springsteen in such an intimate way, no drums, very simple instrumentation, was surprising, Berninger recalled. It was like, what? What is this? Can you do this? It wasn't just the fact that it was a magical record in terms of its scenes and characters. It was the idea that a major rock star could make something just in his bedroom. It exploded so many of my received ideas and told me that maybe I could be a musician. Berninger wasn't the only one who took it that way. However different in scale and effect, Nebraska did for some what the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 did for so many at that time. It said, you can do this. I think Nebraska set so many bands on their way, Berninger insisted. Every band that went after a lo-fi DIY kind of thing. Pavement, Silver Jews, Guided by Voices, all the early indie stuff. I think Nebraska was the big bang of the indie rock that was about making shit alone in your bedroom. It's like when Justin Vernon made For Emma forever ago. I'm sure he was trying to make his version of Nebraska when he did that, and he did. Justin Vernon's record changed the landscape. That project is a child of Nebraska. Warren Zanes. After finishing Nebraska, you said you felt it was your best work. Springsteen. Yeah, I felt that it was. Still may be. Nebraska is the recording that matters the most in Bruce Springsteen's career, but not because of the hits it contains or its renown, or because a generation of young people played it on repeat while they searched for themselves in bedroom mirrors. It needs a different measure. Springsteen made the record when he was the object of tremendous expectations. At times, it almost seemed as if rock and roll were his responsibility. MTV, the emerging digital technologies, the pervasive conservatism of the early 1980s, all seemed to be moving in a direction that had less and less to do with rock and roll's original reckless spirit. It made a kind of sense to hold up Springsteen as the conscience and captain of all that was at risk. Fans, fellow artists, and critics were watching to see what he'd do in the wake of The River, an album that delivered Springsteen to his highest station yet. Really, they were waiting for Born in the USA, and that's not what they got. The truth was that Springsteen was a little lost. He was only a matter of months from a breakdown that he'd speak of very candidly decades later. The role he'd been given as a public figure was at odds with what he was experiencing behind the image he created. He went into a solitude that was more powerful than he was himself. But always a worker, when he was there, he recorded music. The rarest part of that experience, however, was that he released it. That move went against his original intentions, what any record company would hope for as a follow-up to The River and the expectations of his fans. This was the record he did for himself, without even knowing he was making a record. As his manager, John Landau, said to me, if you listen to that vocal style on Nebraska, it's different from any other record. It's like he's singing to himself. Nebraska will become a reference point for people who write songs and record them. A reminder that you can strip off all the wallpaper, tear out the drywall, take it down to the studs. And probably every now and then you should. When Nebraska was first released, and because no one knew what was going on with Springsteen, it looked to some like an act of defiance. To others, it seemed a terrible career choice. There were people who loved it for both reasons, and my old band was among them. Nebraska seemed to take up some of punk rock's unfinished business, which was substantial. Acts that were born into, or at least collared into the punk category, Whether the Clash or more distantly the Police seemed to be getting bigger and bigger in the early 1980s and friendlier with radio, stadiums, charts. It seemed inevitable that these groups would achieve that success, and while there was no reason to begrudge them such an outcome, it was making it harder to see their connections to punk thought and action. Then Nebraska came along, a major release by a major artist, an album that was cutting deals with no one. It might not have sounded like punk rock, but it sure behaved like it. The scurry to figure out what Nebraska was. It was Bruce Springsteen's follow-up to The River, so it was natural that there would be great interest, obscured the brute fact that this was one of popular music's most enigmatic moments, ever. This wasn't an early version of the unplugged phenomenon, which would involve artists on stools making beautifully recorded versions of their hits without bringing a drummer to the gig. This was the sound of a man forcing out songs while held under water, a roughed hand on his neck. He was poised to go big, then didn't. He all but went into hiding. Really, with Nebraska, Springsteen set aside most of what seemed necessary for commercial success, from clean and clear fidelity to perfect performances to putting the artist's face on the album cover. He stripped so much away that really all that was left was the grunt of art. More than 3 decades later, the music writer Bryant Kitching described it as punk as fuck. In a time and place now remembered for its primary colors and pastels, as the moment when music television would begin to challenge the power of radio, and Ronald Reagan would soon speak of morning in America, Nebraska was an unidentified species. It was a recording that had to be figured out, more like a message from across time than another album among the many released in 1982. That year had big winners with Chicago's Hard to Say I'm Sorry, the theme song from Chariots of Fire, offerings from Foreigner, the Jay Giles Band, the Go-Go's, Asia, Men at Work. Nebraska was made on a cassette 4-track recorder, a TIAC 144, a relatively new technology that had been available to consumers for only 3 years at that point. The TIAC 144 was primitive when compared with the gear in commercial studios, but it signaled a shift. Multi-tracking could be done at home, and on a kind of tape you could buy at a record store, even a CVS. But that didn't mean major artists were making their albums on the TIAC 144. They weren't. Springsteen, an old pro at spending his allowance per diem and salary on pay-by-the-day studios, got his 144 and, in one deft move, cut the professional recording studio out of the creative process. While he intended no such thing, it was an act that was prophetic in many ways. By the turn of the next century, artists would regularly take to their bedrooms, kitchens, closets, outhouses, wherever, to make their records. A great many recording studios would eventually close their doors for good because of that migration. By that time, though, the TIAC 144 was a fossil, and home recording had entered the digital age, just as rock and roll was no longer the reigning genre in popular music. In an article titled How Bruce Springsteen's Nebraska Sparked a Home Recording Revolution, Warren McQuiston writes with unbridled joy, recalling Springsteen's gesture and its liberating power. Imagine being one of those musicians starting out in the early 1980s, and you've just spent a small fortune on recording equipment. You and your buddies have been playing around with the Porta Studio, recording some stuff to try to hustle gigs or impress the guy girl you've been trying to talk to for weeks. And then, the biggest fucking rock star on earth releases an album that was made on the same beginner-level contraption with the red, white, and green knobs you've got in your bedroom. You look at it a little differently, right? The freaks had the keys. Underground music exploded, from Daniel Johnston to Ween to Neutral Milk Hotel to Iron and Wine to Bon Iver and on and on. It became the de facto home studio device in early hip-hop circles. Think of your image of Springsteen and what he stands for. Shouldn't that be the guy to popularize a device that took the need for expensive studios away? He opened up the Myers Park Country Club for everybody. But just then, in 1982, Nebraska wasn't simply an outcast when compared with the year's big hits. Nebraska didn't even make sense in relation to the sequence of Springsteen's own body of work, which conveyed some feeling of development and loosely planned, if natural, growth. Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey, the wild, the innocent, in the East Street Shuffle, born to run, darkness on the edge of town, the river. Things have been building in one way or another, with the strong hint of a sequential story. Now this, Nebraska. Nebraska was a cave painting in the age of photography. You had to crawl underground and through a few tight spaces to get at it. Nebraska's production involved the absence of production. There's no producer credit on the album jacket because there was no production, short of the act of saying, just put out the demo. And not everyone involved agrees who said that first. Like the Nationals' Matt Berninger a few years later, my old band didn't know you could do what Springsteen had just done. It was unexpected enough, audacious enough, that we remember where we were when we first held it in our hands. Nebraska, black and white and red, those block letters. Nebraska was imperfect, demanding in the sense of asking too much of the listener. Joel Selvin's original San Francisco Chronicle review put it thus: "It is a stark, raw document, rough edges intact, and so intimately personal, it is surprising he would even play the tape for other people at all, let alone put it out as an album." There was no disclaimer on Nebraska, no defensive maneuvering, no rarities designation, no sticker explaining that these were demos cut quickly and at home. Nebraska was simply Bruce Springsteen's next album. 30 years later, the New Yorker would describe the album's release as a shock, using the same word that appeared in Rolling Stone's original review. And while most shocking things become less shocking over time, this one hasn't. Nebraska was a move bold enough that you could appreciate it as an artistic act independent of your listening experience. Just the idea of it. In that sense, it was conceptual art. To put out as an official release these home recordings, rough sketches done in private, and intended as nothing but an early draft of songs that would later be finalized or re-recorded properly, that alone meant something. Springsteen had been in bands for years, bumping against drum risers and leaning into microphones with guys he'd known since his teens. The River was a culmination of all that. With The River, Springsteen wanted to get on record the sound of his band, the experience of their show. Of them all, he would say, it's the album that most captures what happens when we play. But even when he was halfway through making it, something else was dogging Springsteen. He needed to go somewhere by himself, Nebraska. And really, after he did go there, he never went back.